Okay, as it's 6 o'clock, let's begin the administrative adjustment hearing. This is for the administrative adjustment case AA 2102. In accordance with section 4-205 of the annotated code of Maryland, the planning director is authorized to grant administrative adjustments from certain requirements of the zoning ordinance, parking being one of them, which the applicant is seeking tonight. Shelley and I discussed, this is more of an informal setting. People will not be sworn in, but we will be following the order of evidence laid out by the Board of Zoning Appeals Rules of Procedure. And that would be Mr. Gray presenting the staff report, followed by Ms. Miller, and any other testimony, supporting testimony that from anybody joining tonight. We also come back to rebuttal testimony, followed by rebuttal testimony if necessary. So again, this is more of an informal setting, not as strict as the Board of Zoning Appeals. And with that, Mr. Gray, if you're ready to present.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mr. Depot. Just real brief to go over the staff report. I have a slideshow prepared. The applicant is requesting administrative adjustment approval to the required parking requirements of the City of Westminster zoning ordinance to allow the parking of a catering vehicle located at Lot 4 of the 140 Village Shopping Center, Westminster Mission Barbecue. Information on the applicant's proposal can be found in a November 25th, 2020 letter from Ms. Kelly Schaefer Miller, which is also included as staff report attachment 1. This does not state which of the 11 comments relate to the listed findings contained in the city zoning ordinance.
I'm sorry, Mr. Gray, if it's
Yes.
okay. I do not see the PowerPoint.
Sorry, it was shared to just the internet website for the agenda. Let me go back. But thank you, Mr. Depot. There was no mention of a catering vehicle during site development plan S19-0015 review process. In the June 11, 2020 staff report provided to the applicant, Planning and Zoning Commission, and available for public review prior to the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. During the June 11th, 2020 and during the June 11th, 2020 Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, or on the final signed site development plan S19-0015. For finding 1, the applicant does not provide a clear or viable argument regarding exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or conditions that apply to the property or use that do not apply generally to other properties or classes of uses in the same zone. The constraints stated by the applicant that the redevelopment of the property does not provide for additional room to design or provide for additional parking spaces is caused directly by the applicant's desired number of restaurant seats. The applicant should have taken parking and storage for the catering vehicle into consideration when designing the restaurant and the number of proposed restaurant seats. It should be noted that the required parking spaces used to determine Mission Barbecue parking would be required at any other property and by any other restaurants in the same B zoning district within the City of Westminster. The applicant requested 94 indoor seats, 36 patio seats, and 8 employees requiring 37 parking spaces, and 37 parking spaces are provided for on site. The applicant has not demonstrated an exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or condition requiring the requested administrative adjustment. The required parking spaces used to determine Mission Barbecue's parking would be, as mentioned before, would be required at any other property and by any other restaurants in the same B business zoning district in the city. For finding two, the applicant does not provide a clear or viable argument regarding the preservation and enjoyment of substantial property rights possessed by other properties in the same zone and in the same vicinity. The information provided by the applicant restates the parking requirements that any restaurants proposing development in the city of Westminster is required to meet. As mentioned before, the required parking spaces used to determine Mission Barbecue's parking would be required at any other property and by any other restaurants in the B Business Zoning District within the city of Westminster. If the catering vehicle was indeed a substantial property right possessed by the applicant and others, the catering vehicle should have been mentioned and provided for during the site development plan review process and approval. This appears to be a self-imposed hardship initiated by the applicant, since the number of restaurant seats dictates the required number of parking spaces, and providing fewer applicable seats can accommodate any proposed catering vehicle on site. It should be noted that the city zoning ordinance allows for a reduction in off-street parking requirements by providing designated parking spaces for bicycles, motorbikes, or motorcycles. This provision should be reviewed by the applicant to further accommodate the catering vehicle. Also, staff has researched Mission Barbecue locations around the Baltimore, Maryland area to view the parking situation for the catering truck, and is part of my staff report in attachment 3. Additionally, on February 5th, 2021, staff took photographs of a Mission Barbecue catering vehicle located at the 140 Village Shopping Center, and is part of my staff report in attachment 4. The applicant has not demonstrated that the requested administrative adjustment is necessary for the preservation and enjoyment of substantial property rights possessed by other properties in the same zone and in the same vicinity. The applicant could reduce the number of restaurant seats to accommodate the catering vehicle, absent an adjustment to the parking standards, while still providing between 124 to 128 restaurant seats. Additional reductions of required parking may be allowed by providing designated parking spaces for bicycles, motorbikes, or motorcycles as contained in the city zoning ordinance. As stated by the applicant, 36 seats will be used for a seasonal patio. This would free up 9 parking spaces during the time the patio is not in use, allowing for the parking and storage of the catering vehicle. The director could stipulate that the catering vehicle may be located on the property during the time the patio is not in use, subject to amending the site development plan to depict the location of the catering vehicle and time, non-seasonal, such vehicle is to be stored on site. Additionally, photos of other Mission Barbecue catering trucks and photos taken by staff show the catering vehicle not fitting into a standard parking space. The applicant should provide evidence and testimony on the dimensions of the proposed catering vehicle so the director can make an informed determination if one 9x18 parking space would provide reasonable parking area for this catering vehicle. Finding 3, the applicant does not provide a clear or viable argument that authorizing of such administrative adjustment will not be of substantial detriment to adjacent properties and will not materially impair the purpose of the chapter or the public interest. In preparation for the November 12th, 2020 Planning and Zoning Commission, staff provided the commission with parking information related to the Starbucks Westminster ADA Sidewalk Edition. The parking spaces used by Starbucks on 140 Village Shopping Center required a parking agreement and reduced the number of additional parking spaces located on the 140 Village Shopping Center property to 119. I would like to note that the applicant has mentioned that parking requirements for developments in the city of Westminster are set forth in the city code. The parking requirements for a restaurant use is 1 per 4 seats plus 1 per 2 employees. City Code Section 164-111. There is no reference to required parking for catering vehicles or other business vehicles for a restaurant use in the code. And part of Section 164-112 of the City Code addresses specific regulations to the parking code and does not require additional parking for a catering vehicle. Staff believes that the applicant's statement is not accurate. since the Westminster zoning ordinance is a permissive zoning ordinance, and since catering vehicles are not part of the restaurants and lunchroom parking use, parking for a catering vehicle would not be included in the requirements. Therefore, the inclusion of one catering vehicle parked on site would require separate applicable additional parking spaces to accommodate it. The required additional parking spaces would not be included as part of any parking spaces required for both customers and employees. The applicant has not provided staff with the proposed location of the proposed catering vehicle, and any such parking spaces cannot pose a danger to public health, safety, and general welfare. Testimony provided at the meeting should include where the proposed catering vehicle will be located. At the present time, no location has been identified by the applicant, and as a result, staff cannot evaluate. Lastly, the catering vehicle is large and may block the clear sight triangle as defined by the United States Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration, Intersect Safety, a manual for local roads and local road owners. As both the property and the 140 Village Shopping Center property are owned by the same entity and are currently 119 extra parking spaces at the 140 Village Shopping Center property, additional parking for Mission Barbecue to allow the catering vehicle could be provided, similar to the Starbucks case referenced above, eliminating the need for an administrative adjustment. For the recommendation, staff recommends denial of the proposed administrative adjustment 2101 per section 164-158-1 of the city zoning ordinance due to the following. There are no additional parking spaces for customers and employees on site per city zoning ordinance section 164-111C and the final site development plan S190015 Westminster Mission Barbecue, approved by the Westminster Planning and Zoning Commission during a public meeting on June 11, 2020. The catering vehicle was not included in the parking calculations during site development plan review and approval. Thus, this catering vehicle was not taken into consideration in the final parking count. Number three, the applicant has other remedies available to rectify the parking space shortfall on and off the property as stated in the staff report. And lastly, the proposed catering vehicle has not been identified on the site plan, and as such, staff has not been able to evaluate if the proposed catering vehicle would pose a danger to the public health, safety, and general welfare. Thank you, Mr. Depot. If you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Ms. Miller?
Good evening, everyone. Kelly Schaefer Miller here tonight on behalf of Mission Barbecue. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So I'm on the line tonight. I also have with me Roger Sullivan on the line. He's corporate counsel for Mission Barbecue, and Dave Dodder, who's the regional director of operations for Mission Barbecue. And then we also have Bob Polikoff, who is the president of Feder Management Corporation, who is a representative of the property owner. So I just wanted to introduce everyone. Mr. Depot, I appreciate your introduction at the beginning about, how you wish this proceeding to run. And I intend to do the same thing rather informally, but with everybody here on the line and available and able to answer any specific questions that you might have. So I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to open, I guess you would say, and then kind of do more of what I would say is an oral argument, and then let anybody else jump in with additional facts or information that you're looking for specifically. So as Mr. Gray introduced in his staff report, there is a standard of review that we're looking at here for an administrative adjustment. The code says that the director may grant such adjustments in cases where strict compliance with the requirements of this chapter would result in practical difficulty or unreasonable hardship. So I plan to present you with both of those, even though the ordinance only says or tonight. There are also factors that you may look at under the Administrative Adjustment Procedures Section 5, which just sets forth the same guidance for review that the BZA looks to for variances. So I'm not going to go through those, but I'll kind of conclude by wrapping those in as well. I think that we can clearly show and substantively have shown by the letter that was submitted, I think it was November, and then attached as part of the actual administrative adjustment application, that there is practical difficulty associated with this site. This site is very constrained by the size of it. The friendly site plan, Friendly's was the use on this site prior to Mission Barbecue entering into lease negotiations with the property owner. And the friendly site plan was, I'm going to say, approved in about 97. It shows 32 parking spaces and about a 3,700 square foot building. Mission Barbecue site plan, even though constrained by the modern day regulations, stormwater regs and everything, shows 37 proposed parking spaces and again, 3,700 square foot building. So we're not, my point here is that Mission Barbecue is not further constraining themselves by developing a larger building than was already on this site. If you look back, it's hard to tell, but if you look back at aerials of this site, this has a long history of being commercially developed, which, as we all know, just from dealing with development in general, actually provides an added challenge when somebody's trying to come in and redevelop a site, because you're taking an old site that doesn't comply with any of the modern regs and you're having to make it fit the modern day regulations. So I would submit to you that the site constraints here are actually above and beyond those of an undeveloped site, because you're taking an existing restaurant that's historically been at this property, and you're compounding that by redeveloping it under the modern stormwater regulations. So I don't think it's a minor thing to say that the site is constrained. This is an infill development project in the city of Westminster, arguably, and I would say to you tonight, a desirable infill development for the city of Westminster. And so it's not an applicant created problem that this is already a constrained site. In looking at the unreasonable hardship, I would say to you that it would be an unreasonable hardship to impose upon a developer an unwritten and unforeseen requirement. And when I say that because this interpretation that there is additional required parking for a catering vehicle is not something that I am aware of that any other restaurant has had to deal with in the site development plan process. So it would be an unreasonable hardship to subject an applicant to something that is not in the code and that is coming, I'm going to say, close to 2 years into a site development where hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent on a site to develop it. And we can get into the operational details, but Mission Barbecue this will be the 101st store to open, and every single store has catering. So it's not common to say, oh, well, let's just have this location not offer catering. That is part of what they look for when they're looking for a site. And part of what they expect when they develop a site. And so that all goes into the overhead and the economic investment in a site. If you look at the specific code language, when I say that this is not a written requirement in the code, what I'm looking at is the parking standards in the code. I believe Mr. Gray noted them as well in the staff report, but it's section 164.111 of the code begins the parking regulations. And there's kind of a general provision that says, here are the parking regulations, and you have to meet the standards that are written, standards, I said, quote unquote, listed below. There is no standard in the entire city code that requires additional parking for a catering vehicle. Mission Barbecue is a restaurant. I don't think anybody's denying that. And a restaurant is also not a defined term in the code, so we can't look there for any help. Section 164.111, again, the parking regs, also do not make any reference to additional parking requirements for an accessory use. So if you were to call, I'm not suggesting that you are, but if you were to call catering an accessory use, There's not a specific parking requirement for that. The restaurant use parking requirements say, as Mr. Gray stated, parking requirements for seats and parking requirements for employees. There are several uses that are called out for having required parking for vehicles. Among a few examples are convents and monasteries, which requires parking for floor space plus one per institutional vehicle. Fire stations, which call out one per 1.5 employees, plus one per facility vehicle, plus one per piece of mobile equipment, plus one for visitors' use. And then manufacturing establishments, which says one per 1.5 employees, plus one per company vehicle. So if it was the intent of the code, if it was the intent of the code to require any sort of facility vehicle, catering or otherwise, I think it should be in the code, because the entire intent of the code is to set forth standards that a developer or property owner can look to and understand what will be expected of them in the development process. Mr. Gray alludes to the fact that this was never mentioned. It was not mentioned because it was being hidden. It was not done for any, I don't know, conniving purposes. It was not mentioned because we were unaware there was any requirement associated with a catering vehicle. I can assure you that Mission Barbecue and their engineers took a close look at the city code when they started researching this property and then also investing all their money in it and redeveloping it. So this was not done in a hide the ball sort of way. Let's hide the catering vehicle. There's always been an assumed catering vehicle here. It may or may not have been specifically said at any meeting, but I just wanted to explain that. There's also additional parking regulations in 164-112, which notes kind of things that you cannot violate as part of the parking regs. And none of those are being violated by this. So, again, just going back to the intent of the code is to put somebody on notice of what the requirements are. So it's not a surprise to me that every other restaurant has not been subjected to additional parking requirements for a catering vehicle because the code does not on its face require it. But it would be an unreasonable hardship to subject Mission Barbecue to this requirement that's not written in the code, that none of the representatives from Mission Barbecue could have foreseen, and after such a significant financial investment in the site. So I've touched on practical difficulty, I've touched on unreasonable hardship. There's also an underlying, and I think Mr. Gray notes it in his staff report as well, kind of public policy argument here, which is related to the public health, safety, and welfare of the community. I think we all, excuse me, I need some water, doing too much oral arguing. I think we all agree that the overall purpose of the zoning code is to protect the public health, safety, and welfare of the community. So I think it's very relevant that we look to that. And I think Mr. Gray pointed that out as well. This is a catering vehicle first, in terms of public health, safety, and welfare, is not an appropriate thing to put on a site plan. This is a catering vehicle. And if Mr. Depot, if you have specific questions about it, I'm sure Mr. Sullivan or Mr. Dotter can answer those, but this is a true catering vehicle. It goes to catering events. It goes to sites. It might stay for an hour. It might stay for 4 hours. It depends on the event. It does a lot of weekend weddings. I've personally had one at a brother-in-law's birthday party. So it's inappropriate to have a vehicle shown on a site plan. It moves. It's not a feature of the site. It's just a vehicle, just as any other facility vehicle is for any of the other uses that I listed earlier. This is a highly commercial area. So with a history of being highly commercial, it's not a recently developed highly commercial area on one of the biggest corridors in Carroll County, Maryland Route 140. So That combined with the fact that we have heard no opposition, no concerns from the community. In fact, I don't know about you, but I've heard the opposite of when is Mission opening? When are we going to get to go there? That sort of thing. I think really speaks to the fact that there is not a concern here about public health, safety, and welfare. This is a prime use of a commercial site. I put this in my letter, which was attached to the application, but Mission Barbecue, it is in their economic interest to provide adequate parking for their customers. One lost customer has an impact to them. So for what it's worth, I just want you to understand that Mission as a company takes a very close look at parking when they're evaluating the feasibility of a site. And like I said, this will be the 101st store. Of those stores, they have had no issues with parking at any site. And one of those, one location, the downtown Annapolis, does not have parking because it's a waterfront location. I believe Mr. Gray also stated this in his staff report, but 36 of the seats are patio seats. They're seasonal. So, to the extent that the site is already overparked, which I would say to you is probably a reality, please keep that in mind. Again, I don't think there's any disagreement here. Maybe there is, but the purpose and the intent of the parking regs is to provide maximum on-site parking. The intent being to protect adjoining property owners from any negative impact as a result of a site not having enough parking. So the calculations in terms of the spaces provided as required under the code is designed to have a developer provide the most spaces necessary. In keeping with that, as you look at 164.112, it even outlines how you calculate employee parking, and it says that it's to be calculated based on the maximum number of employees to be employed at any one time. So this just really speaks to the fact that the parking regulations are already designed to maximize the parking on site, which in this case, especially with 36 patio seats, is really likely to result in an overparked site, I would say to you. I know Mr. Gray kind of analogized this to the Starbucks site plan, but I would say to you that this is actually quite different because this property is under common ownership with that entire, what we know as the 140 Village Shopping Center. If you're familiar with that area, and there's several different lots and parcels, but if you're familiar with that area, you'll know it as the Shoppers Shopping Center. Then you have the strip of retail with the Genova's Pizza and I think Blue Point Crab House. There's the Five Guys, there's a Dunkin', there's an auto use in the one that's in between Mission and Dunkin'. There's that strip of retail and offices over on the side of Liberatories. And then there's also the Martin's Westminster, which is an event facility. Those are all under common ownership here. So in the Starbucks case, that property is owned by a different person. So they could not have just said, oh, we're going to use, or a few of our customers might park over on the 140 Village Shopping Center. In this case, we can say that, and it might happen. I mean, who knows? Sometimes that Dunkin' drive-through line blocks an area. And so if I go there at a certain time and the Dunkin' line's long, then I might park over in the Shoppers and walk over because I'm the type of person, I have no patience. I'll admit it. So, I'm not suggesting that it's going to happen regularly. I mean, who knows? But what I'm saying is it's different than the Starbucks situation. The Starbucks was totally different ownership. And so there had to be a formal agreement between the owners. Here, it's all common ownership. Mission Barbecue is leasing this site from the owner of the greater 140 Village Shopping Center. We did take a look at, Roger probably pulled more information than he ever thought he would on the parking of other Mission Barbecue sites. The problem is that they're not very comparable. And that's because this site is technically a separate lot in the 140 Village Shopping Center. So when you're looking at these parking requirements and you're looking at the site plan for this, you're truly looking at the site plan of lot 4. The other similar Mission Barbecue locations are part of a larger shopping center. So I'm just going to throw out an example here. It's not the same at all, but if you know the Denny's in Westminster, that's actually part of that greater shopping center. So that all shares parking. In this case, technically speaking, we're our own lot. So because the other Mission locations are most similar to the Denny's and not most similar to this, there really wasn't comparable parking data other than just hands on or feet on the ground, people saying, we have 101 locations, we've never had a parking issue, we've never had complaints. And similarly, we've never had additional requirements imposed on us for the catering vehicle. So I just want you to know that we did take a look at that, and that's kind of what we have to explain to you there. Obviously, we're asking for your approval here tonight. Nowhere in the request did I say 1 parking space, 2 parking spaces, 5 parking spaces. I believe the request was really just for a catering vehicle for the Mission Barbecue site plan. So I did just want to point that out as well. As I kind of opened with, and I don't know, Mr. Depot, you can tell me if you'd rather me do like a summary now, or if you'd rather ask some questions, and then I can kind of go back and summarize.
I do have some questions, if that's okay.
Okay, please.
So to the catering vehicle itself, we've had a lot of questions about that too. The size of the vehicle and the uncertainty of how many parking spaces it takes up. And that was brought up in the staff report. Would these vehicles, through some of the other pictures we've had, depending how the vehicle's parked, whether it's perpendicular to these spaces or parked, parallel, can certainly affect how many spaces are being used, further affecting the number of spaces in sight. And also, it would be nice to hear the operation, how these are used, how often they're used, as a primary function of the truck itself. Because again, looking at some of those pictures, it's hard to tell, are some vehicles there permanently, or are they moving on a regular basis, as Mr. Miller mentioned? So if somebody can address that.
Hey, Kelly, do you mind if I jump in?
Nope, I was just going to ask you, Roger, go ahead.
Okay. Hey, good evening, everybody. Mr. Gray, thank you for your summary and your information. Mr. Depot, nice to meet you. I've seen your emails going back and forth. Glad to see that there's really a person behind the email address. So good evening. For the record, Roger Sullivan, I act as general counsel to Mission Barbecue across the nation. And I'd be remiss if I didn't start off by saying we are very much looking forward to becoming neighbors and friends and part of the fabric of the community in Carroll County. This will be our first Carroll County location. We're very much looking forward to being there. And right now we're scheduled to open up at the end of March, and look forward to seeing everybody in the booths and in the dining room. Because the mission of Mission Barbecue is to serve those who serve. And part of that is providing a world-class dining destination and all that goes with it. And that's why we're asking for this relief. And Mr. Depot, with respect to your particular inquiry, I can give the exact dimensions. The truck is 23 feet long, 9 feet tall, 8 feet wide. So it doesn't quite fit into a standard parking spot as you are intimating. With respect to some of Mr. Gray's comments and the pictures that were taken, the pictures that Mr. Gray put up on his, when he was sharing the screen, those are representative of what the catering vehicle looks like. They're converted military deuce and a halves that we have customized with our trade decor, our trade dress. And Mr. Depot, I'll answer 2 parts of your question at once. Actually, it's part of what you asked and part of what Mr. Gray asked. At this particular location, we do not have a designated X marks the spot for the catering truck. That is the case at some locations. Here, where we have the entire parcel, the landlord leaves it to us to find the most advantageous spot and or the most convenient spot on any given day. As Kelly alluded to earlier, the catering vehicle is just that. It is a street legal, fully insured, fully operational, road ready, over the road vehicle. And it does just that. As Kelly mentioned, she has personal experience. It was at her brother-in-law's birthday party. I've been at social events where I show up for my cousin and whatnot. Hey, there's the Mission Barbecue truck in the driveway. That truck leaves the location with regularity, not only for catering events, but as a delivery vehicle. There is a sort of catering season, if you will, from about March through November, where it'll be leaving the site more often. And then not quite as much as you might imagine in the heart of the winter, but it does move regularly. It moves throughout the year. So when it comes back, where it left might be occupied by a patron, it'll park in another location. And so another thing that Kelly mentioned is that this will be the 101st site. We have over 100 of these locations because we spin them up and obtain them even before the locations open, as is the case here. It's on site right now. We have not had a single location across the nation where we have had to have the parking yield count against the catering vehicle. And I wanted to, although you didn't ask this, Mr. Depp, I did want to mention, I think it bears mentioning, I think it's critical, in fact. Kelly is exactly right. We didn't stumble on this. We don't do these locations by accident. By the time we put a shovel in the ground in Westminster, we were $150,000 into civil engineer, architect, and council fees on issues just like this, whether we can or cannot build a location, have what we need on site. We drill down to the nth degree. We have a enormous commercial lender that puts us through our paces. They also drill down. There are usually 3 to 5 lawyers looking at this. There are 2 to 4 civil engineers looking at this. There are 1 or 2 architects looking like this. So that entire team looks at whether we can or cannot develop a property as we intend. That would include the on-site location of the catering vehicle. And Kelly was exactly right. We didn't not show this because it was a hide the ball. We didn't show it because it wasn't, we felt there was no need to show it. There was no need to ask for additional relief. We were here because we are asking. We were told that the county is Carroll County, Westminster City is looking for confirmation that this will work. And so here we are. But when we started this project, when our civil engineers told us we could do it, when our architect told us we could do it, when our council told us we could do it, as Kelly said a few minutes ago, there was nothing in the code. And as I sit here this evening, I still have not seen anything in the code that requires that we would have to reduce our parking yield to accommodate for the catering truck for the reasons that Kelly said. And so there was no intent for nefarious dealings or obfuscation. We didn't think it was needed at all. Now that we've been requested to offer an explanation, we're here this evening. But we didn't foresee it. We didn't anticipate it. And as Kelly indicated, I think anybody in our position would have taken the same approach. We are not putting $2 million into this location by happenstance or by accident. We drill down to the last letter of every statute so that we know what we're getting into. And I'm asking and I'm hoping, Mr. Depo, that you'll concur that the request made is an appropriate one and that you would grant the relief requested. And as Kelly indicated, we didn't ask for any given amount of spaces, just that it be permitted on site. And the other parking, in terms of how much space it takes up in the parking yield, that I did want to address another point that Mr. Gray made about the seasonal nature of it. To the extent that you do grant the request, and I ask that you do, that I ask that you not condition it on seasonal use. The 9 spaces Mr. Gray spoke to about when the patio is not being used. Our intent is to have the vehicle on site at all times and all seasons, so it can fulfill its role as a catering and delivery vehicle, consistent with what we do at other locations, both outside of Maryland and here.
Thank you. So when are the outdoor seating not in operation, I guess?
Yeah, sure. So as a practical matter, in northern environments, as you might imagine, from November through March, it gets less use. But I'll give you a perfect example. The location in Perry Hall, Maryland, very similar in terms of its square footage for the side. It's an end cap. It's not a standalone, but within the four walls, it's similar. Patio size, also very similar. And if you go there tomorrow, when it's going to be 55 degrees, here it is, the heart of the winter, but I guarantee you there'll be people sitting on that patio. So we do make year-round use of the patios. That is true. As a practical matter, I mean, nobody was there on last Wednesday or Thursday, right, when it was snowing. That's for sure. But I guarantee you there'll be somebody out there tomorrow. So we and clearly in our southern locations, they get used heavily year round. Here, I think it'll be a typical Maryland location that will be seasonal, and bad weather, people won't sit there. Good weather, they will.
Thank you. Because some of the other questions I had, just going off of Andrew's report, and I've spoken to Kelly about this as well. The ordinance today, whether the catering truck should be required to have its own parking spot or not, we differ in that understanding, but the ordinance does allow for other remedies that could reduce the number of parking spaces. As simple as a bike rack would reduce one. The other thing too, and Kelly touched on it, the adjacent property owner does own land at, I think, in excess of 119 parking spaces, I believe. And I do concur with their statement that it is different. Starbucks, being a separate entity, certainly would need that easement and that agreement to park. You being the same property owner, that's not typical that you would grant an easement or an agreement to yourself for additional parking. But was that ever contemplated too, just designating additional parking spaces on the adjacent property, again, to address the possible loss, if that is the determination that the vehicle has to have its own parking space?
Yeah, so thank you. I understand the inquiry, and I have seen that done in other applications, as Kelly indicated, like in the Starbucks, where they may have, and I don't know anything about that personally, but I understand they may have been short on their parcel, so an easement agreement's entered into to get 5 spots from the adjacent property or that kind of thing. So those of us that are in that world have done that and seen that, myself included. To answer your question, was it contemplated? The answer is frankly, it's no. So in other words, before we signed our lease, before we did the site plan, all that stuff was researched in advance. And our civil engineers, our architects, local council, et cetera, came to the conclusion, I understand that you and I may differ, but reasoning minds can differ, came to the conclusion that the 37 was a net, and we were good. And so we didn't even, to be frank, we didn't even contemplate it at all because the site would accommodate what the code required. So the threshold answer is no, we did not. But now that you've put it in front of us as a possible workaround, like, could that be done? Could I, Mark Depot, condition my relief on his stealing 4 spots or 2 spots or something from the adjacent parcel? I can't speak for my landlord, but I will tell you that generally the answer is as follows. Most times for a location like this, the landlord is not in a position to, quote unquote, give those locations, because in most instances, there is a common area parking field, the 119 or whatever it is you just referred to which the landlord has already committed general parking rights in common with all other tenants, whoever else is in that shopping center, and typically is contractually prohibited from designating a given spot or spots plural to anyone else. So for example, let's say we did that and the landlord said, I'm going to give you these 4 quote unquote designated spaces as sort of overflow to fix your zoning problem, to the extent that is a zoning problem. A hypothetical tenant in that shopping center could raise their hand and say, well, wait a second. I was counting on 119 spots for my whoever that hypothetical tenant is, and now I only have functionally 115. Mr. Landlord, you've violated my lease. And so most landlords are very reluctant to do that. And I'll give you a real world example from Mission Barbecue. It happens with great regularity in a large shopping center, unlike this, where we have our own parcel, where we're just one more tenant in the field. And like here, we're going to designate our veteran parking for our heroes and for our to-go or pickup. The landlord will typically tell us, I can't give you, air quotes, those designated reserved locations because the parking field is in common with everybody else in this 140,000 square foot shopping center. What I will let you do is mark them, and hopefully, just like handicap parking, most non-handicap people don't park in handicap, but some do. Similarly, most people don't park in our veterans unless they're a veteran. They don't park in to-go unless they're picking up to-go. But it illustrates the point of the restriction that is imposed on a landlord with other tenants in common. So the answer to your inquiry is, we could reach out to the landlord. My guess is he would be sympathetic to that proposal, but unable to fulfill it because of binding lease obligations to everyone else in the shopping center. That's been my experience.
But Roger, when you say that, are you, and I'll let Bob, I see Bob's ready to jump in too, but I just want to make sure Mark's clear. We're talking about designated parking spaces. Like here's a plan with 4 spots that are designated. Nobody else can use them but us.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And that's how I understood the inquiry. If the inquiry is, could we just make use of them like anyone else? And I will yield, of course, to Mr. Polikoff as the landlord. My guess is that the landlord would be amenable to that, but I certainly can't speak for Bob.
And
Okay, so
I'm sorry.
I'm happy to speak for Bob if Mr. Depo and Mr. Gray or want to hear from me.
Yes, please. I guess that what I was looking at, I wasn't necessarily stating, and I understand not marking or designating specifically. Again, the property is in excess of the parking standards by 119 parking spaces, but it's making available to. In other words, essentially, it would be just say 2 were allocated to Mission Barbecue. That would then reduce the total of in excess parking to 117 as an example for 2 spaces if that was necessary. So just that concept.
So if you're looking to designate on site, these spaces are for Mission Barbecue, that becomes problematic because then every one of the merchants in that shopping center is going to say, well, I want to have 2 parking spaces marked for me, or I want to have 3 or 4, however many it is. And then it becomes impossible to manage and to police. With 111 spaces in excess of what's required, to be able to say to Mission Barbecue, on a non-exclusive basis, we're willing to allow your use of the parking lot in common with others. I think that the fact that there are so many spaces in excess, that's something that we can certainly do without creating problems with all of the other tenants. Again, available on a non-exclusive basis, and we can limit if we needed to limit 2 spaces, 3 spaces, without designating on site what those spaces are. We can certainly do that. It would just be problematic to mark them and to reserve them only on an exclusive basis for Mission Barbecue.
I guess that
again, if the shopping center were at its parking limit, or close to the parking limit, I can see where it would be a necessary or desirous to do that. And then we would have to deal with whether or not we chose to do that or could do that or not. But with so many in excess, to be able to say, yes, you're available to use them, because their lease line is the lot line. So we could certainly say on a non-inclusive basis, we would allow your use of whatever 3-4 additional spaces. I think that would be accommodating to them and meet what the city of Westminster requires.
Thank you. Roger, you had mentioned 4 parking spaces. I guess that goes back again. How many parking spaces does this vehicle, do you envision that it would take up?
Yeah, so I may have just thrown out 4, just like Bob was throwing out 2 or 3, but to answer your specific question, left to right, it fits in a standard space. It's not wider. It'll fit in a standard space left to right. North south or front to back, it exceeds a standard space by about 5 feet. So, and Mr. Gray had provided some representative examples of how the truck gets parked in a whole bunch of different ways depending on any given location. Generally speaking, if it's running perpendicular into spaces, it'll take 3. Because it's a 23-foot vehicle, standard space is 9 by 18. So it would take 3 if it ran perpendicular to those spaces. If we run it into a single space and it's perpendicular to the next row, it'll only take its own space, but the nose will block the side spot. So functionally, it's taking 2 spaces. So if, and then sometimes, of course, if you've got the parking spots that are like this, nose to nose, it'll take those 2. So to answer your question, depending on how it's oriented, we do have locations where it gets by with 1 and the nose sticks out, but the drive aisle is plenty wide, so we're okay there. Otherwise, they're perpendicular to each other like that, and it's taking 1 but blocking 1 for 2. If they're like this, it'll also take 2. And then if it runs, 1, 2, 3, but runs this way, it takes 3. So I think the safe answer to your question is 2 or 3 if we don't have wide drive aisles, I think is a safe answer.
Thank you. I have nothing else right now. If Kelly wants to summarize.
And Mr. Depot, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to do a summary to kind of touch on back to the legal standard that we're working with here. So thank you for being here tonight. We are asking for your approval of this request to allow the Mission Barbecue catering vehicle at this site. The code requires, as I said, a showing of practical difficulty or unreasonable hardship, both of which we've shown you tonight. The practical difficulty constraint of redevelopment on an infill site we touched on, and as far as unreasonable hardship, the fact that no other restaurant has been subject to this requirement and that it was completely unforeseen after a few $100,000 have been invested in the property, but what Roger said is ultimately a $2 million project in the city of Westminster. I think those both really speak to the practical difficulty, but probably strongest to the unreasonable hardship that Mission has experienced. The code also says that you may look to the variance standards, so I'll just briefly touch on those. The first says that there are exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or conditions applying to the property in question or to the intended use of the property that do not apply generally to other properties or classes of use in the same zone. Mr. Gray's staff report essentially said that there's nothing exceptional about this. I would argue the complete opposite. This is a unique property. The aerials show that it's been commercially developed since at least about the 1980s. It's very difficult to redevelop a site under modern regs that was initially developed at that date. It's located right on Maryland Route 140, which is arguably the largest state highway in the county. And we did face unique stormwater challenges here. This site, again, kind of takes being super familiar with Westminster, but there's a downstream problem from this property. And because of that, the stormwater engineer looked to Mission Barbecue to contribute to solving that during the site plan process. So, and I'm not going to get into details, but it's a significant downstream problem. I mean, they've done significant improvements to Route 140 to try to resolve it over the years. And so that was, you know, a hurdle that is very unique to this property that they had to deal with. It's also unique that, or exceptional unique, whatever you want to call it, that this is commonly owned. You don't often find such a large swath of different properties, parcels and lots, and that are all under common ownership. This is divided into several different parcels, but it is all under common ownership. The second standard for variance for the BZA is that such variance is necessary for the preservation and enjoyment of substantial property rights possessed by other properties in the same zone and in the same vicinity. This is not necessarily a variance request, so I'm not suggesting that, but given that it's one of the guiding factors that you can look at in your consideration, I would ask you to take into consideration the fact that catering is an inherent restaurant use. As you heard, every one of the 101 Mission locations offers catering. It's part of the value of this business and was factored into the economic investment that this business visioned when it came to the city of Westminster. The code, as I've said several times, has never been applied to require additional parking for catering vehicles. So to do so now would take away a substantial right of this business that many other businesses in the city enjoy. The third standard under the BZA variance language is that authorizing of such variance will not be of substantial detriment to adjacent properties and will not materially impair the purpose of this chapter or the public interest. As I've said, I think it's pretty clear that the intent of the code is to provide for adequate parking to avoid any negative impact to adjoining properties. This is a highly commercial property under common ownership in a highly commercial corridor along Route 140, I should say. There's been no community opposition to the request. As you can see, there's nobody on the line here. This was even above and beyond the notice requirements of the city. This was actually also advertised in the Carroll County Times. And we still have heard nothing from the community. So I don't think there's any reason for you to think that this will cause an impact to adjacent properties. Part of that obviously being because most of the adjacent properties are under common ownership. So obviously the owner took this into account when deciding to lease this property to Mission Barbecue. Those are kind of just nailing down the legal standards that you're guided to look to, Mr. Depot, in your consideration of this request. But I also think it's important just to look at the whole global request and you know, the logic and the overall role of protecting the public health, safety, and welfare of the community here. And I hope you take that all into consideration in making this and granting this to Mission Barbecue so that they can have this catering truck. Ultimately, I do feel like this will offer a service to the community. This is a use that's very desirable. I've heard nothing but when is it coming from people. And so I think that the restaurant itself and the catering use will provide a needed and wanted amenity to the city of Westminster. I know Mission's looking forward to it, to opening and to being able to offer these services. So I would ask that you approve this without any conditions here tonight. And if you have any other questions of us, we are here and happy to answer them.
Thank you. Andrew, do you have any rebuttal statements?
Mr. Depot, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for providing information on how many parking spaces the Mission Barbecue catering vehicle will take. One of my just thoughts, because when you would leave that site and as cars exiting Baltimore Boulevard onto Jerrimore Lane, if the Mission Barbecue catering truck is sitting sideways. And it goes to my comment about protecting the public health, safety, and general welfare. Wondering if that could block that clear sight triangle, that line of sight. So if you're exiting Mission Barbecue and a car is coming around and they can't see because the truck is there, could that cause a potential accident? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about my computer's smarter than I am. It actually came on and told me nobody can hear you. But I could hear you. So I have the question. I was trying to say, I suppose anything is possible. So I guess the answer to your question is, in theory, yes. I'd be quick to add though that by happenstance, I was out there a couple months ago doing a site visit as the building was coming up, and I would suggest that the catering vehicle, while it's large, isn't remarkably large. And when I was out there, I happened to notice there was a bread truck making a delivery out there to somebody. There was a work truck. There was a Verizon truck. While your point's well made, I would suggest that it's not, the catering vehicle is not unique in that it's larger than a passenger vehicle by any stretch. And so any other vehicle that pulls on site, as I said, a Verizon truck, a delivery truck, a bread truck, anybody is going to present the same challenge to pedestrian and motorists that the catering truck will. And so I think in that regard, while it might be a technical, hypothetical possibility, it's no more realistic than any other larger vehicle on site at the shopping center.
If I can jump into, I'd also like to say, I think that might be an issue, again, if this were a permanent feature of the site, like if that was the spot that the truck was going to be parked in, that's something we could analyze a little bit more deeply, but that's not the case. And everything you've heard has been the opposite of that.
And then, Mr. Depot, my only other comment would be with the parking requirements contained in section 164-111D of the city zoning ordinance, that the seats and employees dictate the parking requirements. And that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Depot.
Thank you. Ms. Miller?
Do I have any questions of Mr. Gray?
Or any other additional comments, or Mr. Sullivan or Mr. Polikoff?
I would just ask, I guess, Mr. Gray, again, this is really, we're not doing testimony, but to the extent you have any historical knowledge, has any other restaurant that has gone through a site plan process in the city of Westminster been subjected to requiring extra parking for a catering vehicle, to your knowledge?
I would say no, because we would never foresee a catering vehicle.
Thank you.
And nothing else? Okay. Ms. Miller and I had a discussion about whether decisions would be made at the hearing or following. Looking at the rules of procedure, it appears that written testimony is required, or written decision is required, which would obviously follow the meeting. But with that, and similar to the BZA, I think it would be appropriate to make a ruling tonight following an action written decision. As far as a catering vehicle, and Ms. Miller and I have disagreed on this fact, I would tend to believe that at the time the ordinance was written, that catering vehicles was not a standard practice. And it is now more of a standard practice, as Mission Barbecue and other restaurants provide these type of vehicles on site. Therefore, I do think that there is an extraordinary circumstance with the ordinance itself, that if there is common practice for catering vehicles, I do believe the ordinance should make reference to that. It does make reference to vehicles and business vehicles being required to have its own individual parking space for other uses in the ordinance. but the restaurant does not. So the thought would be, if this is a standard practice, maybe the city itself should be looking at amending the parking requirements to address this possibility. So I do think that the ordinance, again, is lacking some newer aspects of restaurants and restaurant operations. So with that, I do believe the vehicle is an allowed use. I think the catering service itself would be accessory to the restaurant. The vehicle would be an acceptable use for the catering use that is accessory to the restaurant. So the issue here for me is not the vehicle itself and whether that's allowed. I think it would be an allowed function and allowed use for the property. The preservation and enjoyment of substantial property rights. Again, I think my concern is still with the requirement of parking spaces and what the intent of the parking spaces are. And that's for customers and employees. And reducing that, the concern would be that it would then not be in conformance with, or would be an issue with parking. And furthermore, I'm concerned with the number of spaces. That's, if it was one space we're looking at and we define it as one space, it certainly makes the decision easier and more acceptable to be down one parking space than 3 or 4 on a consistent basis, and the ability for the vehicle to move around the site and is also concerning. The substantial detriment to adjacent properties, I agree with Ms. Miller that we are owned by the same property owner. And I would think that a non-exclusive ability for parking would certainly address any concerns we would have with underparking the Mission Barbecue site. I wouldn't look at requiring a defined parking space on the adjacent parcel, just that there are additional parking space available, and Mission Barbecue would have ability to use some of those parking spaces when necessary. So I am going to approve the administrative adjustment for the parking of the truck on site. Unfortunately, I would like to limit that to a space or 2 spaces, and that that we do find a more specific location for the vehicle. Concerned with Mr. Gray's comment about site distance, concerned with moving the truck throughout areas, the impact it might have with other parking spaces adjacent to, that would be concerning as well. So I would like to look at a more defined or understanding of where the vehicle would be parked on site and the actual number of spaces being lost. That would, through a non-exclusive ability, or even accepting the fact that, as Ms. Miller pointed out, that even the loss of a parking space or 2, Mission Barbecue believes that the number of parking spaces is still adequate for the use itself. So again, I am approving the administrative adjustment. However, such adjustment may have those additional conditions applied to it. And if I do require a specific location or space, we can do that as what is called a simplified site plan, a simple process to designate those parking spaces.
Mark, can I jump in just quickly on the simplified site plan?
Yes.
I understand your concerns. We appreciate that you're approving this, but considering certain conditions, I would ask that the conditions not include anything specific about a simplified site plan. If we can resolve this in an easier way that doesn't require a simplified site plan is going to be subject to review. I know a few that have recently gone through the city that have gotten multiple rounds of review comments, plus there's a pretty substantial submittal fee. I think that we can resolve your concerns through something a lot simpler than even a simplified site plan. So perhaps if you could just maybe couch that in those terms, if you're willing to consider that, that's what I would advocate for, not specifically defining it as requiring a simplified site plan. Thank you.
I'm okay. I am actually okay with that. The site plan was recently approved. It's not like this is a site that where we have a plan that is 5 to 10 years old. So we are familiar with the property and the site. So I would be more than happy to work with you to in another fashion to for that versus a simplified site plan.
Thank you.
And with that, unless somebody has any specific questions or concerns, Mr. Sullivan,
No, I was waiting for you to sign off. I was going to thank you for your time this evening.
thank you.
And I'm hungry for some brisket.
I think a lot of people are. So again, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. I will get out a decision as quick as I can, and I will reach out to you, Ms. Miller, to talk about any means of trying to designate a space or at least general locations of where it's anticipated to be located.
Great. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.